Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Munish Gupta. I am the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia from New Delhi. And we continue our series of very relevant and important webinars as we've been doing throughout the pandemic in the last year and a half or more. Today, we are going to have a very important discussion on a very timely and vital subject, something that's been a silent killer, or I think even more than a silent killer. And living in New Delhi, it almost seems like we are sitting in a gas chamber at times. And as the world focuses on climate change, I think we need to focus our attention on very important issue of air pollution. So to move things forward on today's webinar, I would now request my colleague, Emily Schmall from the New York Times, based in Delhi. Right now, she's in Chicago, and she's also the vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia to take it from here forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Munish, and hello and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia and our ongoing panel discussion series. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and if you're coming back, it's so good to have you here again. Thank you all for supporting our programming throughout the pandemic. We are really fortunate to have a very illustrious panel this evening to talk about what Munish said could be considered the most critical issue in India today: air pollution and its impacts on public health. Dr. Gaurav Gogoi is a Congress Party Member of Parliament from Assam who sponsored a private member's bill to amend India's Air Act of 1981 so that it includes a focus on the deleterious effects to human health of bad air and also incorporates a system of accountability for state and national figures who monitor air pollution. Welcome, Mr. Gogoi. Dr. Maria Neira is the Director of Public Health, Environmental and Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization. She is with us today from Geneva. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Neira. And lastly, Jyoti Pande Lavakare is co-founder of the nonprofit Care for Air and author of Breathing Here is Injurious to Your Health, a first-person, meticulous, and exhaustive account of the fatal consequences of India's air pollution. So thank you all so much for being here. After a brief discussion, we will open up the conversation to the audience. We invite questions and comments throughout the hour. You can post them on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or the FCC South Asia site, wherever you're watching this broadcast, and we will receive them here and pose as many of them as we can. So Dr. Neira, I'd like to start with you. Even though on the worst pollution days in Delhi and of course in other cities that grapple with air pollution, the air is actually seen. It takes on a smoky haze. Air pollution is largely thought of as an invisible problem. Can you please briefly describe why it's so dangerous to breathe toxic air?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for organizing this type of dialogues, because I think we need still to make sure that everybody understand the horrible figures associated with exposure to air pollution. And let me start with the first one, which we have repeated these figures almost every day, several times a day, but I have the impression that still is not reaching all the citizens, and therefore they don't understand how urgent and how serious this is. Every year we are losing 7 million of our citizens, 7 million of our people globally, because there are premature deaths because of exposure to the toxic air we are breathing. Why so toxic? Well, imagine that you are putting on your lungs toxic particles that are in the air. They go to your lungs and they cause a lot of damage, but they don't stay only there. They can go to the bloodstream, and from the bloodstream, they can reach any organ in our body. So it's really very damaging for our health, creating very serious problems from respiratory diseases, lung cancer, pneumonia, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, but as well stroke and ischemic heart disease. And now we are getting more and more evidence about the damage that goes into our brain and our neurodegenerative problems associated with that. So the picture is really very dramatic, but the interventions, the ways to solve it, if we have the political commitment and if we raise awareness and people realize that this is an emergency, I think we can move on it. And that's why I think events like this one are very important to raise this very much needed awareness.
Thank you so much. Well, that leads very well into my next question, which is for Mr. Gogoi. Um, you recently tabled a private member's bill to amend India's 1981 Air Act. I'm curious, what resistance does the bill face both inside and out of Parliament in the larger Indian society?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to everyone. My bill focuses on the key institution which exists in India that monitor emissions from industrial units, and that is the pollution control boards. We have at the central level and we have the state level. These pollution control boards are really functioning with their hands tied behind their back and are unable to have the kind of checks and balances that you need on modern industrial units. Now, you asked me about resistance. I would not say it's a resistance, but the government is looking at somewhere else. The government has created a new national body that only focuses on a very specific part of India when it comes to air pollution, and that is the part around the national capital region, around Delhi. So it has created a new national body, which is the National Air Quality Commission, with upgraded powers and functions, but it has limited its geography to only a particular part of India. Whereas we need to have looked at the entire gamut of North Indian states, right from the west to the east. And therefore, I think the government has caught itself in a trap by thinking that air pollution is only a Delhi centric issue, whereas it's a national issue. It's an issue that runs across Maharashtra to even my home state of Assam. The government has done another national plan, which is the National Clean Air Program, and it has given grants to local bodies under the 15 Finance Commission. But if you don't upgrade the institutions, if you don't give them legal backing, you might have all the plans and all the budget, but they will not be fully utilized. So that's my key worry.
Well, then let me just ask you, why wouldn't the government give these bodies legal backing? Why would there be any hesitation there to make sure that policies that are meant to protect people would be given teeth?
Well, Emily, that's a good question, and I think that's a fundamental characteristic of Indian policy making. Is that when we have a issue, then we try to create a new body, and we instead of looking at the existing techno policy legal structure, often in the present and in the past, we feel that a new body with higher powers, with higher sets of accountability, will be able to solve the issues. But what eventually happens is that it leads to some kind of a turf war, into a territorial struggle between the older established structures, which are there, like these state pollution control boards are in every state. And then you have this new structure which has been superimposed. And therefore, you have this territorial logjam. And those who have lived in Delhi understand that how many of Delhi's issues are not solved because there's a complicated web of institutions and you can't fix any accountability as a reason. So I definitely think the government really needs to introspect on this, and they should rather focus on building the capacities of local institutions and local governments.
Thank you so much. So I now want to turn to Jyoti, and by way of a question, I'd ask if she could please first read an excerpt from her book.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to begin reading the excerpt, I just wanted to give it a little bit of framework. I was born and raised in Delhi, and I do remember air pollution not being so bad. As a cub reporter, I also remember my office was in what is Delhi's Fleet Street, and there was a sign up there which used to talk about how Delhi was at that time even second most polluted city in the world. But then we had a switch to from diesel to CNG in our public transport, and we saw a great deal of change. Subsequently, I moved abroad, and I had little children when I wanted to move back to my country. And I came here, and to my horror, I found that air pollution had really gone through the roof. I started a nonprofit called Care for Air with a bunch of other parents who were concerned about their children. And subsequently, a couple of 2 or 3 years later, again, to my dismay, I found my mother was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, which doctors said was triggered by air pollution. Which really showed me that despite knowing so much about air pollution, I hadn't myself realized how it was in my own backyard. So in that framework, I'll just read the epilogue from my book. And this is when I've sort of explained how we discovered all these things about my mother's cancer. And at the same time, I was learning more and more about air pollution. I will never see my mother again, hear her melodious voice practicing her tans, except in my dreams. Then, over time, as my friend Anjali, who lost her beloved father to lung disease and was quietly shattered by it, says, I will be afraid of forgetting details. I know I am not alone in mourning someone lost to a cause that can be linked directly to the foul air we breathe. Every day, I come across more and more people who are suffering from lung disease, cancers, fibrosis, strokes, cardiac disease, and so many other diseases that are triggered by air pollution. Friends whose mother's lungs were found to have fluid, whose fathers suffered a cardiac arrest soon after Diwali, non-smoking neighbors who got a sudden severe lung infection in the North Indian winter, elderly relatives who were admitted to hospital for a broken hip after a fall, but passed away from lung infection. I never wanted to be an activist. I'm not a pollution expert, scientist, public health researcher, or epidemiologist. I never set out to be an environmentalist. I think of myself simply as a survivor, an aware, informed, and vigilant resident of Delhi who is trying to survive Delhi's poor air amongst its other urban challenges. Diwali used to be a time when I prepared my house for festivities and opened it up to friends and family. But now it is a time when I start worrying about the air quality and start shuttering my home to the outside air, duct taping each window carefully in order to protect my family. That sinking feeling in my heart begins usually after Dasera, just before the bright winter sunshine of my childhood withers to a dull, dystopian gray when stepping out of the door makes my eyes water. Every so often, I have a sudden memory of another sky, a clear, bright blue, of crisp mornings. Back then, I could enjoy the beauty of an orange-pink sunset without haze obscuring my view. Winters meant outdoor picnics with friends under cotton-ball skies. Now I worry that I will grow old in the dim haze of grey Delhi winters, the winter of my own life overshadowed by the debris of diseases triggered by pollution. My few remaining friends suffering with me, those who can get away forced to scatter. I know many others feel the same way, those who have known a different Delhi, who still have fleeting memories of that long vanished sky. Delhi's toxic pollution has become much more than an environmental problem for me. It is now an existential crisis that clings to me like a dull, aching sadness. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So you have been able to channel some of your grief about your mother's illness into this book and into this nonprofit Care for Air. And as everything else in this world and in India, there are some class differences in how people can protect themselves from this pollution. But whether you have a house with windows sealed with duct tape and expensive air filters on, everyone in Delhi and in other cities in India with bad air is exposed. Why do you think more citizens are not demanding solutions? And what calculation do you think people are making? And why do you think that calculation is wrong?
So I would absolutely agree with you on, I actually feel very strongly that air pollution is a social inequity. I mean, there are two aspects of it. One is complete lack of awareness. When you have no awareness about what you're breathing and how it is affecting you, then the next step, action, does not come. The other thing in India, I think, is there is a lot of denial. There's denial. I myself went through that phase of denial. I didn't want to believe that I'd chosen to come back to a country where the air pollution was so bad that it was affecting my children and myself. Um, but I would say that, in fact, now research is showing that not only does air pollution affect your lungs, and like Dr. Neira said, it affects every part of the human body. There is research in, I think the Sri Jayadeva Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences in Bangalore has shown that techies, auto rickshaw drivers, our traffic policemen, construction workers, they don't have that sort of luxury to work from home, most of them. And so air pollution affects them much more severely and in ways that they probably can't even imagine. The reason I think we're not able to really ask for this in one voice is, like I said, a lack of awareness, denialism, fatalism. Despite there being 70,000 scientific papers that link air pollution to health harm, a lot of people don't know this. And unfortunately, when you don't know what you want to ask for, you're not really able to ask for it in one voice. The other problem is that I think the costs of air pollution are hidden. Like air pollution itself, the costs are hidden. There are external costs that are not taken into account. So when governments talk of GDP growth, what they're not taking into account is a very sick demographic. India is supposed to have a very young demographic dividend, but we don't realize that when 400 million people in the Indo-Gangetic Plain are breathing such terrible toxic air, then that demographic is going to be a sick demographic. We are setting up our young for failure. And that, I think, is not something that is taken into account in numbers like GDP growth. And then the last thing I would say is, unlike COVID, where everybody knows that a virus causes this disease, air pollution is a very stealthy, I would say, enemy. It will cause disease over a period of time. It causes mostly non-communicable diseases. It will trigger things like diabetes, hypertension, etc. And those don't show up. It's very hard to prove. And, I don't think people are able to really say. There are very few people who will have air pollution on their death certificate, although now in the UK, we have seen that there is a mother who has fought to get that air pollution put on her daughter's death certificate. And I think that will be happening more and more now. So those are the real reasons why I think people have not been asking in a strong enough way for more urgent action in air pollution, although it's growing.
Well, thank you, Jyoti, and thanks to all our panelists for having started this discussion. We should open the floor now to everybody who's watching. They can pose their questions here through Facebook and YouTube. They can write their questions in, and Emily would be happy to ask those questions. But let me start with my question first, and I would address this to Dr. Naira. How far up high in priority does WHO rate air pollution as a killer? And I want to particularly contextualize this during the ongoing pandemic times. And what's the advisory that WHO gives to member nations? It's been a perpetual and growing bane, air pollution, of the modern industrial world. world, and it goes on and on and on, and we're trying to deal and grapple with just a 1.5 year pandemic. So, how do we take this, this very critical issue as far as WHO addressing the world is concerned?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. And again, it's a very difficult answer because let's start, as you say, contextualizing. If you put the number of deaths caused by exposure to air pollution, and you take the last 2 years and you put the number together, we reach 14 million deaths in 2 years, 14 million premature deaths because we have been keeping breathing air that is literally killing us, because we are still burning fossil fuels that are responsible then for this pollution that will end up in our body. When you see that number, you will expect everybody to be absolutely on an emergency mood and requiring very strong government reactions and even citizens mobilizing and saying, "How can you accept this?" The only figure that can be compared is the one caused by tobacco, smoking tobacco. Again, around 7 million premature deaths and a lot of cost for our health system because, let's talk about cost as well. I know that people use that argument for not having more action. They say, well, investing on tackling the causes of climate change and air pollution requires a huge investment. You are making that investment already. You are paying already through the health system an enormous cost to treat those diseases caused by exposure to air pollution. Those diseases are chronic, and therefore they will require hospitalizations and long-term care for most of the patients, and of course millions of quality life years for the patients, in addition to, of course, the fact that you suffer, but there is no money that can quantify that. So all the arguments, you will expect that all the arguments to put air pollution at the top of your priorities are there. Huge public health problem, an immense cost for the society and for the economy of the country. It can be repaired. I mean, it's not that the argument of saying, well, we don't tackle air pollution because we need to keep polluting the world if we want to develop economically. That's not true. That's not an argument, because at the contrary, the countries are developing because they understood, after many, many years of mistakes, they understood that this is not a way of having a sustainable economy. So even countries that in the past were polluting a lot, now they realize that there is no way to have an economy that is sustainable if they go for that. So WHO is doing a big effort to put this very much, very high on the agenda. As you know, the COVID-19 has been responsible for more than 2 million deaths in 2 years, which is horrible. It's really very dramatic. And we don't like to compare, what is worse. Of course, TB, malaria. If you put TB, malaria, HIV together, the number of deaths is less still than the 7 million caused by air pollution. But I think it's horrible to compare. Each death is a, if it can be avoided, it should be avoided. Each death represents one person, one family, a loved one. So there is no price and no cooperation. But there are diseases for which we are struggling. We are trying to put some solutions. But for air pollution, the solutions are there. And it requires brain, require understanding of the problem, and will require political courage. I mean, people need to take this and decide that this is good for my society, this is good for my.
I think perhaps we've lost Dr. Neira temporarily. Dr. Neira, if you can hear us, your screen is frozen. Let me turn to Mr. Gogoi and ask you, how likely is the private members bill you've sponsored to be passed, and what other efforts are you taking politically to address this? And also, as Dr. Neira and Jyoti were mentioning, there's this calculation that policymakers, the citizens make, that it's too costly in some way to address air pollution right now. So how do you factor that into the arguments you're making in Parliament about why this must be addressed now?
Thanks, Emily. So, in my interactions with the Ministry of Environment and with the Union Environment Minister, I've been told that the bill that I had submitted, which is now in the records of the Parliament, was actually studied a year ago, because I had put the proposal in then, and some of the suggestions which I've made in the
Can
bill
Are you able
vis-a-vis
to join? Yeah, are you able to join back?
some of the suggestions that I had made vis-a-vis the state pollution control boards, those suggestions or those approaches have been incorporated in this new body which the government of India has created, which is the National Air Quality Commission. So let me give you an example. Because one of the key principles I'm pushing forward is that air pollution is a multi-sectoral issue, because the pollution sources are from industry, are from agriculture, are from housing, from real estate, and from the Ministry of Transport. So if you need to tackle these issues, you need to have a multi-sectoral approach. And in the existing design of pollution control boards, they represented only people with a background in environment and did not allow representation from these other departments. So that was an amendment that I brought in my private members bill vis-a-vis the composition of these boards, the pollution control boards. So that approach of having representatives or multiple stakeholders has been incorporated in this new body, which I said is for the national capital, for Delhi and surrounding areas, and they have representatives from different departments. So I'm happy that this approach has been understood by the government. But as I said, that it needs to be a pan-Indian approach. It can't be just a Delhi-centric approach. And in order to keep highlighting this issue, what I've done along with my colleagues from Parliament is that we've convened an informal group of parliamentarians on clean air. So we've got this bipartisan parliamentary group cutting across different states of India, both north and south, east and west. And we are trying to kind of inculcate this sense, both with the union government and with the respective state governments, that air pollution needs to be addressed. So if we are in the state of Maharashtra, we discuss about Maharashtra and we try to, see what issues the state of Maharashtra are encountering when it comes to air pollution and what can we do. So as a result, what I've seen is that even now, right now, there is a debate that is undergoing in the Lok Sabha, a discussion on climate change. And many of the members of parliament of the Lok Sabha are talking about air pollution and the climate change. So I do see a growing sense of awareness amongst policymakers. But, the last part of your question, which is that, what I often find is that in Delhi, air pollution, when it comes to a health issue, is a quite a top priority health issue. But as you move away from Delhi to other states, then air pollution as a health issue competes with other health issues. That could be malnutrition, it could be tuberculosis, it could be anemia, it could be groundwater contamination. So air pollution, as we move from Delhi to other parts of India, competes with other health issues, and therefore doesn't get the attention that it deserves, doesn't get the resources or the political leadership that it deserves. And I think what we have to do is therefore bring more of this, have more of this public research, which focuses on the health impacts of air pollution. And these these studies need to be done and conducted in every state, so that the state institutions and political leaders get into action and give it much more priority than what it is getting currently.
Okay, and I think Munish had a question for you, Mr. Gogoi. Thank you so much.
Um, you know, I know that vehicular pollution is one of the most important aspects of air pollution in Delhi, and We can't blame it all on what the farmers burn every year, the stubble. And I think India is trying very hard to move towards electric vehicles. So what's happening on that end? Because that could potentially lead to some respite from this, if not a final solution.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, on the issue of stubble burning, that it serves as a distraction from addressing the real issues. Air pollution is not a November 15 to December 15 when stubble is being burned in Punjab, Haryana. No doubt they add and they contribute, but the base level of pollution in Delhi is already so high that if we have to address the base factors and not these, incremental spikes. And as you said, vehicular emission is a very important part of addressing air pollution. Now, there are two approaches to it, and I am a big believer in bringing in electric vehicles. But just to take a step back, we also have to understand a fundamental issue when it comes to public transport is that we have to ensure that we have more and more of public transport, and people of Delhi and other major capital cities and towns are able to use public transport, whether it's traveling to school or traveling to universities or travel to work. I remember there was a national scheme on urban renewable mission, and that did gave a lot of financial muscle to different state governments to buy buses and procure buses, which added to their fleet, and therefore more and more people could shift from private vehicles to public transport, metro being another example. So I think let's not forget about public transport and all that we need to do, especially in cities like Delhi. Yes, when it comes to electric vehicles, the government of India has announced certain subsidies for consumers to buy electric vehicles, and I think those are very generous subsidies. I think government needs to focus on two-wheelers, because the two-wheeler people who purchase two-wheelers would definitely benefit from subsidies, and therefore having electric two-wheeler might be easier. So I do see a adoption of private electric vehicles, whether it's two-wheelers or four-wheelers. But I also hope that the government would convert its buses into electric buses. So the state transport departments own so much of public vehicles, so much of buses, whether for moving from district to district or within a local city. So I think state governments also need to use the budget to buy or to enhance the number of electric buses in their fleet. Thank you.
Well, I have another question from one of our members, Arun Goyal, and we talked about the inequity aspect earlier, and you mentioned it yourself. Especially in countries like India, which have just sort of hit the middle income status from being poor nations. This the Supreme Court, the National Green Tribunal, and everybody, maybe even laws in Parliament, are going to clamp down on factories, are going to clamp down on vehicular pollution, are going to clamp down on brick kilns, the old brick factories where the bricks were made, many other such things. And so, what does it do to people who are? I mean, Delhi has what, 2.5 crore population already, and of these, 1.5 crore or 15 million people actually live borderline on poverty, or sort of below. So what does it do? How do we address these inequities? And is that the political pressure on governments and parliaments not to go the far, to the far end, and really come down with fast regulations, and sort of take things forward quickly?
So, Manish, very good question, and I must compliment whoever asked that question. But remember, it's not only air pollution which is forcing India down a low carbon path. We just amplified our targets in Glasgow when it comes to our renewable energy targets, when it comes to being net zero, and all of our decisions and policy announcements, whether related to climate change or related to air pollution, will have a transition period and a transition cost to it. So even if we focus on renewable energy, for example, that means it's great for the renewable energy sector. But for many people who are employed both formally and informally in coal and coal mines, what happens to their future? So this is a very important question, but it also means that it can't be ignored, or you can't not address it. You have to, in fact, look upon it as an opportunity of shaping the future and making a comprehensive plan. And therefore, you need all state governments, district governments, and the national governments, civil society, academia, media to work together. Because whether it's air pollution or whether it's our commitments to Paris and Glasgow, India is being forced down a low carbon path, and this too can create jobs. This too can reduce the compliance burden. This too can reduce the disruption that people at the bottom of the pyramid will feel, provided we plan right. And therefore, I often feel that this is, COVID taught us about how center and states can work together. COVID taught us about how districts can be decentralized when it comes to planning for their development needs. And there was a national whole of government approach and a national whole of society approach to COVID. And definitely, when we're talking about a low carbon green path, which binds us to our targets and reduces air pollution, we have to have this approach. And therefore, we have to look at new institutions, and we have to look at laws, and we have to create the amount of finance that we need to help states transition to this. And at the core of it, have the people whose employment and livelihoods will be disrupted, because already they are facing an economic uncertainty. And if you're not able to plan for this disruption, and you're not able to help them through this disruption, I think it will create a lot of angst and a lot of anxiety. And we've seen what happens in a political environment when the traditional sectors like mining and automobiles and coal, when the lakhs and lakhs of workers who are attached with these sectors, if we don't plan for the futures, it also creates a very a toxic environment for politics. Thank you.
So, can I just add to this answer? I think it's really very important to have health as the focus. And when you're looking at with health as the primary focus, it's like asking somebody, will you take 1 million rupees or will you take lung cancer? No one's going to choose lung cancer. So, in a situation where, like recently, we managed to get through the Supreme Court ruling, firecrackers banned. A lot of people are talking about, again, the livelihoods of firecracker units, and the firecracker manufacturers have come and said, again, that same argument about lives versus livelihoods. I think the right answer is to train and plan, like Mr. Gogoi is saying, plan ahead. Now, if you accept that the firecracker industry is a sunset industry, and you need to retrain those workers into other emerging renewable power, for example, if the government and all its an all party kind of a collaborative effort can be made to phase out these highly polluting industries and retrain those workers towards better livelihoods, I mean, nobody will deny that even firecracker workers, those little children with those little fingers putting explosives into pieces of paper which will be burnt and will create pollution for their lungs and all our lungs, is definitely not something we want to focus our growth and energies on. So I think if this sort of planning happens, that will be a great thing. And then if this is planned ahead, things like wasting money on red herrings like these smog towers, we've spent 40 crore rupees in Delhi on 2 smog towers that are doing nothing to reduce air pollution. That same money could be deployed in getting electric buses or public transport, or retraining people towards areas where pollution actually comes down and doesn't go up. So I think these are all things that I think our governments and our politicians, and we look towards aware legislators like Mr. Gogoi to bring this all to the floor of the House, so that we can get our right to breathe clean air.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to move toward what the international community can do to support India and bring back Dr. Neira into this conversation. But we have a great question from someone watching, Sharabanu Frosh, who says, how do we get governments to move from short-term reactive measures like closing schools and construction sites to actual solutions that put money and capacity building into tackling pollution at source? Dr. Neira, I don't know to what extent you can talk about what the WHO does or the larger UN universe does to support this kind of transition. Mr. Gogoi was talking about financing. What can be done to support India as it develops and as it seeks to create millions of new jobs for its young population every year, while at the same time taking proactive measures to curb air pollution?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Mr. Gogoi raised a very important point, which is that this transition has to be healthy, green, and fair. And of course, we need to start to work, or we should have started already a long time ago, on this transition and how the workers that are now surviving because of coal or because of other type of business that needs to disappear, even the fossil fuels producers, this transition has to be done in a very strategic way by our governments. But just the two considerations, it has to be done with ambition and speed, because we cannot use the excuse that the transition will be complicated. It will be certainly complex because we are talking about a huge country like India, but it's a country with a lot of potential, a country with developing good technologies, a country with a very rich brain power. I mean, people train and now representing very strongly on the international society as well. So we expect from India to be able to lead this transition, but of course it cannot be on a short term. It has to be with a very strategic, holistic view. And this takes me to the issue of the electric cars at the city level. We can't solve the problem of air pollution at the urban level just with one measure related to now inundating our cities of electric cars. The idea is to have a look at the sources of pollution and tackle all of them and make sure that we stimulate, facilitate access to sustainable public transport, electric ones, rather than replacing every car we have now by another one, which will not create the healthy environments that we need. What WHO is doing is, of course, we produce all the evidence saying how this is affecting your health. But in addition to that, we look as well at how this is affecting your economy. And then we look at what the access to renewable sources of energy will represent for a country. And we did studies with our colleagues from IRENA or the World Bank, where they have demonstrated that $1 invested on jobs, on fossil fuels, or $1 invested on renewable energy, you will have 4 jobs for renewable energy and 1 for fossil fuel. So I think all of this, of course, the transition will be complex. Nobody will deny that. But our society is in complete evolution. I mean, we are using computers now. Until yesterday, we were using typing machines. And the advancement on our society cannot stop us from taking these decisions. I think the coal industry is dead long time ago, should have been dead. And of course, being very conscious that we need to take care of the coal miners, because they are very difficult jobs, very tough jobs, and not very well paid. And they need to be transforming to another way of making their earnings every day. So for WHO, we are conscious very much that it's not just the health. Health can drive all of this agenda, and health can be a very powerful argument for moving more. But there are very good investments that can be done to ensure this transition and to do it as soon as possible to reduce all of those debts. On a holistic, strategic, and with courage, as I was saying before, and of course involving the society and the private sector for them to create this employment that is so much needed. But I think this transition to renewable sources of energy is so important. The country that will speed up this transition will be the winner, because in all terms, in economy, in jobs creation, and in solving the health problem, and solving the issue of inequities as well. So I hope that India will be the one leading that, and we will all can learn from your experience and your piloting. So I am hoping very much that the parliamentarians and the politicians from India that were in COP, they were very keen on going for those commitments that made in COP to fight against climate change, because reducing climate change for us will be translated into a reduction on air pollution, and therefore hopefully starting to decrease the number of deaths every year caused by air pollution.
Well, thank you. Yeah, speaking of COP, as we all know, at the very last minute, some language was changed in the agreement, some language that China and India had asked for, that didn't meant to not ring the death knell for coal, but rather gradually move away from coal. And I'm wondering, unfortunately, we were to have someone from the Bharatiya Janata Party, a member of parliament, but she is in her constituency today and wasn't able to join us. So unfortunately, Mr. Gogoi, I'm putting the burden of the governance questions on you again. But why was there this sort of last minute backtracking, do you think, on the language around moving away from coal in India? And why is that such an intransigent position here, for the Indian government not to just completely finish with coal and move headlong into renewable?
Well, Emily, I would tell you to watch the debate in Parliament, because it was the Indian Environment Minister who introduced this change on coal, on the language related to coal, moving it from phasing out to phase down. And we're having this discussion, and the Union Environment Minister is likely to respond on climate change, and especially what happened in Glasgow on Thursday. So I've just, let me say, I can't respond for the government, but I'm just plugging for the Environment Minister over here. But nonetheless, at the same time, we have to realize, the Indian perspective is that even if you're transitioning from one energy form to another energy form, it requires finance. It requires innovation. It requires giving fiscal incentives, and therefore a lot also depends on, linking back to your previous question on international finance, whether that's public finance or whether that's private sector finance. I think, a big part of the issue around air pollution or climate change would be finance, because again, the solutions will not come from only national governments. The solution will come from local local councils and local municipal corporations and local village councils where there are coal mines or steel plants. And so therefore they will all need capacity building in terms of brain power and intellectual input, but they would also need a lot of finance. So I would say that, the government, whether it's the center or at the state, will have to work in partnerships, whether it's with civil society and with groups like Jyoti's, who I think are doing fantastic work. But we also have to, help and build this civil society ecosystem, even in states like Assam and West Bengal and Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And also in academia, we need a lot of research and investment in research as well. And I think that's where, again, the international community can help us. So, just to summarize, in finance, in fostering civil society, and in building capacities of academia, I think the international community has a strong role to play. Thank you.
Well, I'd follow up on what just Mr. Gogoi has said, and the question is to you, Dr. Naira. that look, we all understand that we have to move rapidly as fast as we can away from coal and towards renewable energy. But he hit a very important point, and that's not just India's position, but probably that of another 100 countries. Is that developed and developing or emerging countries like India still have perhaps the resources and the fiscal incentives that they can give to their private sector or whoever else look after their poor populations. But what about these other 100 countries that are coming that want to come out of the throes of poverty and unfortunately have no incentives, have no resources? And how do you actually cajole them? How do you stimulate them? What kind of incentives can the global community channelize to them so that they don't go down the wrong path, and then 10 years down the line we are again looking at another India, another China somewhere, and say, oh my God, how do we bring these people back to track? So I think in that regard, what Mr. Gogol just said, that it's very, very important. If countries like India, with our trillions of dollars in the economy, are still worried about where do you get the resources, and we still have to phase down versus shut down, then what are we doing for the rest of that world, for those 100 countries? And you talked about earlier the World Bank, and I know there is a climate action fund, which is almost worth about $10 billion. So how are these, sort of actions and energies being put together, synergized and collated?
Yeah, no, your point is extremely valid. It's clear that we need money to support the countries now to do this transition, and particularly for those, the poorest countries, for them to avoid to go into the same mistakes that the rich countries made and for which we have polluted the way we have been polluted. WHO provides what we call the health argument. And the health argument is saying, okay, look at, if you invest on this type of interventions to reduce air pollution and to tackle the causes of climate change, look at the health benefits that you can have. But in addition to that, we use that health argument to discuss with the World Bank, to discuss with the Green Climate Fund, and we have very often discussions with them to make sure that the projects they will be financing will have health as a driving force. Because if you put health at front of any of those transitions, then the benefits will be in many fronts. Will be on the equity front, on the sustainability, on greening, on economy. So I think if you use health as the driving force, you can obtain many more co-benefits associated with that. So the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Fund, they need to maybe now start to commit on a very strong way, these famous 100 billions that were committed years ago, and that we hope that the countries will commit. And again, on a very strategic way. We cannot use all of those funds for ad hoc initiatives. It has to be strategic, trying to understand what the technology is needed for and where it will have the biggest and the most powerful impact, and then using that for other countries to learn. We need to be, as a society, very smart these days, and we have no choice. We need to be very smart as a global society, because we see what's happened when you pollute the environment and the ecosystems. We are more vulnerable to a virus that can, even if in the number of deaths is one of the key health problems, but we have many others, but it was able to paralyze all our society, to put her on our needs because of a virus. So we need to be more conscious of that and stopping to destroy the environment, because otherwise our society will be really at risk. And at the moment, I'm afraid we need to be a little bit wiser if we want to pollute everything we touch, what we eat, what we drink, what we breathe. And that's not good for the economy, not good for our health, not good for our society, and not good for our survival. So yes, we are every day trying to talk to the development banks, the special funds that have been created, and even with the countries that are doing investments in poor countries, making sure that those investments are already thinking in that way and are sustainable, and not still creating in business that will give money few months and then create a huge problem for the society that will stay longer.
I think it's time to probably just wrap up now. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Naira. Thank you for joining us from Geneva and from WHO, Mr. Gaurav Gogoi. I know you had a very tight schedule. You came straight from Parliament, joined us, and I know you have to leave again. I would like to thank Jyoti Pande. She's not just a member of the Foreign Correspondents Club, but one of the crusaders, and keep up the good movement, and we'll support you wholeheartedly, Jyoti. And thanks, Emily, for joining us from Chicago. And we hope to see you back in India very soon. Please give our best to your mother. And thank you. And once again, a very interesting discussion. And we are sure to carry this forward at another time. And we would not lose sight of this subject. Rather, we'll keep pounding at it in a couple of months again. Thank you and good night from the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia in New Delhi.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.